Welcome to episode 185, Fostering Resilience Against Suicide, Helping Clients Build Lives Worth Living, featuring Jessica Gifford, licensed independent clinical social worker. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes. By Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am excited today to be joined again by Jessica Gifford. She is a licensed independent clinical social worker, and she joined us previously in a discussion about social connection and its impact on mental well-being. And today she's joined us for a conversation about not only suicide and suicidality, but the preventative element of how do we, as she says, put clients in a position to have a life worth living where we never get to a thought about suicide. Thank you so much for joining us, Jessica. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this.
So before we dive into this topic, why don't you again remind our listeners about yourself and your background and how you came to really dive into this work about not just suicide prevention, but specifically social connection and its impact on our mental wellness.
Sure. So I am a social worker and started out doing clinical work and burnt out. I got more into the preventative field. So that's like the thumbnail version. In terms of suicide prevention, like many people, I think many clinicians choose their area of expertise because it's something that affects them personally. And this is something that impacted me personally. I lost my father to suicide when I was a teenager. And obviously that really turned my life upside down. And I think one of the ways that I tried to process grief was really trying to make sense of it. And it can be a really unfathomable thing, really hard to wrap my head around. And so I think I really started to try to understand suicide and suicidality more. But also, even from the very beginning, I was more interested in why, what makes people want to live despite everything, as opposed to what makes people want to die. So my master's thesis in social work school was called Learning to Live with Oneself, with a really long subtitle. But essentially it was, I interviewed, I think 12 people who had lived through a suicidal crisis. And I was really trying to learn what helped them get through it, what made them choose to ultimately live, and what was helpful. And actually, social connection was one of the biggest themes that came out of that. And since then, there's just been tons of research showing that social connection protects against suicide, as well as making basically all aspects of our lives better. So in more recent years, probably I would say definitely the last 3 years, I've opened my own business, really focused on working with schools, colleges, and businesses around building connection. So I've really kind of chosen to double down on connection as a protective factor for mental health, but also just for happiness.
Your work is really upstream versus what is so often downstream in conversations about suicide. And my brain automatically goes, as I'm sure other clinicians may, to a safety plan, and the stuff that we're these boxes we're supposed to check that even the research has generally disproven as effective, but we're still doing it. And this is a scary topic for clinicians to talk about because the odds of us having a client die by suicide are not insignificant. And that pressure for clinicians, I think, can seem overwhelming. And I appreciate your perspective, which is basically we could create systems and insulation from this risk by doing what we're already doing kind of therapeutically, by building social connection, by evaluating this as a prevention and early intervention perspective instead of reactionary. You, just to throw it out there, before we started recording, you told me about an article you just seen in the New York Times. Before we start recording, will you please share that? And as we record this, we are currently in May of 2023.
Yes. So the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, just there's an article in the New York Times that he wrote, but he just released an 80-page report, essentially naming rebuilding social connection as a national public health priority, which is very exciting to me, obviously, that it's getting attention. And he really highlights the impact of loneliness in a number of areas: physical health, mental health, work, education, all spheres of life, and includes recommendations for building stronger connection in our communities as individuals and workplaces and so on. So that was really exciting to me.
When you said that, there was a word that jumped out to me, which was rebuilding.
Yeah, he says
Rebuilding.
rebuilding. He says rebuilding. So I guess, when you do look at the kind of the longer term trajectory around social connection in this country, there definitely have been times that there's been stronger levels of connection, but it has been on the decline for, I don't want, but decades. Definitely decades, and more sharply in the last 2 decades, but probably has been declining for the last 50 years. So loneliness has been increasing, connection, involvement in social, different social activities has been declining. More people are living alone, and so on. So yeah, I thought that was interesting too. The rebuild. It jumped out at me because I always say building connection when I'm talking about it. But if we look way
Right. But we
back,
see that it was there and then we lost it and now we're rebuilding it.
but I think many people, especially younger people, haven't necessarily experienced genuine connection, or aren't really satisfied with the level of connection in their lives, so they might not be able to relate to a word like rebuilding. For them, it's kind of creating from scratch.
Can we start there in this conversation? Can you kind of paint the picture in terms of the research, the demographics, what we're talking about here with suicide and how social connection kind of layers over on top of that?
Yes. So in terms of suicide, suicide rates generally are measured by the number of suicides per year out of 100,000. So if you look back to 2020, the number was 10.4 out of 100,000 people committed suicide in the US that year. In 2021, that was 14.1 out of 100,000. So it went from 10 to 14 in 20 years, and that's a 36% increase. And so, 14 out of 100,000 might not feel like that's a big number. And in terms of raw numbers, that's 48,000 people in 2021. And there's not data yet for 2022. So for young people, 10 to 34, it hovers around the second leading cause of death, sometimes the third, but often it's the second leading cause of death. And in the US overall, it's the 10th leading cause of death. And, we're talking about suicide rates, but the impact is much bigger than that, because for every completed suicide, there's 250 people who have seriously considered suicide within the last year. So that's a lot. And I was recently reading, there was a study of high school students. And so 9% of high school students, which is 1 out of every 11, made a suicide attempt within the last year. So that to me is really scary, that it's that high. And there's definitely certain certain populations, certain communities that are at higher risk. LGBT students are 4 times more likely to make a suicide attempt, and with what's happening politically, I think we're going to see increases in states that are coming out with blatantly transphobic, discriminatory practices. So, so other populations that are at higher risk include veterans, Native American and Indigenous communities, rural communities, and actually elderly people. So even though kind of talking about youth being at high risk, the rates of suicide have increased more in the young population. So it's been like a sharper incline, but adults above 75 are the most likely to commit suicide. Does that make sense how I'm
It does. It
differentiating
does make
that?
sense. One thing I'm curious about, if we can jaunt over into it, talk to me about the language around suicide. So we historically used the term committed suicide. Now there's the introduction of the idea that committed implies that it was a criminal act. As someone who studies this, how do you feel about the use of language and the way that we're describing the act of ending one's life?
So when I was actually doing research for my senior thesis, which was back in 2000, the language that they used for a completed suicide was successfully completed, which to me, there's nothing successful about suicide, and so I don't see that language now. So I'm glad that that has changed. I haven't really thought. I guess I use the language completed versus attempted, but I hadn't really thought through committed. I haven't heard kind of dialogue about that. So that's something that's interesting to think about.
Thank you. I was talking with another colleague who does a lot of suicide prevention training, and she and I were talking about it in this idea of the languaging around suicide as a verb, that someone suicided. Like, there's the
Yeah.
interesting use of language. And
Yeah.
I think for any of us, we're in a world where language is continually evolving. And then
Yes.
for us to do our best to stay up to date on something like successfully completed, which is, to me, sounds like a very odd way
Yeah, that's
to
really
say that.
strange way. And just off the top of my head, I think commit implies sort of forethought and planning, which definitely is sometimes the case, but also there's many suicides that are more impulsive. And so I think completed or suicided is maybe more accurate.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Thank you for kind of going over into the languaging around it. So, as you mentioned, we have certain groups that right now are at higher risk of dying by suicide than other groups. Then you throw in COVID-19. We've seen an increase in reported depression, anxiety, an increase on college campuses of suicidal thinking, things like that. How do you, as someone who looks at this, break down that research and seeing these increases in the last couple of years? Do you attribute that just to the pandemic? How are you kind of breaking down that data?
So actually, when you look over the past 20 years, it was a steady increase in completed suicides from 2000 to 2018. And then there was actually a slight drop in 2019 and 2020. And then it actually has started increasing again. It increased again in 2021. And so I did see some data that was released really early in the pandemic in the first few months that showed a big increase in suicidal ideation. And so it's interesting that there was an increase in ideation and yet a decrease in actual suicides in that 2 year 2019 and 2020 window. I do think sometimes times of crisis can kind of change people's focus a little bit. It can pull people together, or it can kind of distract. There's so much external crisis going on, or so much different kind of crisis going on that maybe that could partially explain why there was that dip. But then 2021, it sort of rebounded. I'm anticipating when the 2022 data comes out that we're going to see a continued increase, because some of the predictors of depression and suicidality include social isolation and connection. And obviously that is something that took a huge hit during the pandemic. And so we know that depression, with depression and loneliness, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg, because depression can definitely cause social withdrawal and increase loneliness. And at the same time, there's research that says that loneliness predicts future depression. And so loneliness is causing depression, but depression is also causing loneliness. It's both and. So I think it would not be at all surprising if we see continued increase, because the impacts of the pandemic are going to last for a long time. They're not like, oh, we're back in person, everything's back to normal, yay. I think I work a lot with colleges, and definitely schools and colleges. I just heard from so many people that students are back, but they're really struggling with increased social anxiety, with disengagement, with withdrawal, and things like that. And so I just hear more and more about people, in particular young people, struggling with how to make connection.
As we're talking about this, I've noticed that most of the research that you've been mentioning has been specific to the United States. Are there any worldwide trends relating to these things over the last few decades, or particularly related to the last few years?
Yes. So definitely the other kind of westernized countries like the UK, Australia have very similar, Canada have similar trends. There was one international study looking at high school students, and it looked at, I believe, 30 different countries, and saw a huge spike in loneliness from 2012 to, I think, maybe 2018 or 2019 was when the study was done. So that so that's showing that this isn't just the US. It's really everywhere. Although I do think there are some cultures that are doing better on connection than we are, but this particular study was looking at high school age, and it was kind of theorizing about the impact of social media and technology, and was also linking that to a kind of a parallel spike in depression over that same time period.
That element of it, I mean, the irony, and we talked about it in the social connection episode as well, but the irony about this complete increase in the sense of being connected,
Yes.
and exposure, and arguably technological vulnerability, if you will, like online persona vulnerability, while simultaneously in the data seeing we're actually incredibly disconnected from one another, is really disconcerting. And speaking as someone who's worked quite a bit with teens and young adults, seeing that so clearly, of the friends that are IRL, that are in real life, versus the friends that are online. And it's been so interesting as someone standing on the outside of that phenomenon, who did not grow up with the social media pressures. It had just started into the world when I was in college, so I largely was removed from it. But to look at how it shaped social development in younger folks these days is just like nothing else we've seen.
Yeah, I think it's huge, and I think we're probably going to be learning the impacts for a number of years to come. But one of the things I mean, I don't want to completely negate the value of social media, because I think it can provide benefit, that there are online communities that can provide support and can provide access and community for people who might otherwise not have found that. So I think there can be value to it, but I think there's also a lot of harmful impacts, and one of them that I believe contributes to suicidality is I really feel like in the last, I don't know, maybe decade or so, there's this combination of having higher expectations for what's possible or for what our lives should look like versus what they actually do look like. So social media and media, we now have like access to the 1%. We can watch the Kardashians and
The
watch
lifestyles of the
the
rich and famous.
lifestyles. Yes, exactly. And we're told, many kids are told, like, you can be anything you want, and that's I think meant to be an empowering message, and it can be an empowering message until you're trying to become, the next influencer or the next Jeff Bezos or the next whatever, and it's the next 30 under 30 and it's not happening. And so I think we have higher expectations about being happy, that we're supposed to be happy, we're supposed to have these great lives, and then maybe less tolerance and less coping skills for the struggle and for things being messy and for going through pain or for failure, mistakes, disappointments, and so on. And so I think that combination of high expectations plus maybe like low tolerance for discomfort or things not being the way we want them to be can really contribute to suicidality, because people can feel like, I'm a failure if I haven't achieved this goal. There's actually this kind of surprised me when I was looking at suicide data. You would think that the happiest countries in the world would have the lowest suicide rates, but the opposite is actually true. So Scandinavian countries have the highest rates of happiness in the world, but they have some of the highest rates of suicide as well. So possibly people who are really struggling or who are experiencing depression or so on, if they're looking around and everybody else is happy, that can make their experience harder. So I thought that was interesting, but I think that contrast is happening everywhere, where we're looking around and we're feeling like we should be having this type of life and we're not. Should be having this feeling and we're not.
I think that idea is an important one to think about, the visibility of have and have not. And I've seen the same thing in the research, in the sense that when you were looking at areas where people were, geographic areas where people were reporting higher levels of life satisfaction, for example, that at least the studies that I was seeing was suggesting that in those areas there was less obvious comparison between have and have not, that it was like a community that may not even have had very much and had, interestingly, a fair amount of poverty and food insecurity and things like that. And yet they weren't also right next door to a mansion where they're throwing away lots and lots of food scraps. And so they're not, it's not like in our faces all the time. But I could see what you're saying about Scandinavian countries, that when we are constantly exposed to how our lives should look, it messes with our sense of self and our confidence.
Yeah.
And in the era of social media, we have to pretty much continually remind ourselves that what we're seeing is a curated version of somebody's life. And I think that's why, like, at least for me, when I see something on social media where someone says, like, this is how I actually look But if I stand this way in this lighting with the camera here, then it looks like this, like kind of this reminder where it's like, this is all manipulated. Like,
Yes.
this is not an accurate representation of this person's appearance or of their happiness level. Like, it's really easy for anybody to look happy when they're on a catamaran, like in twinkling green waters,
Right.
like,
Yes.
at least I hope so. But so that reminder that I think we're inundated with messages about how happy other people are. And when we're not, it's just viscerally painful.
And sometimes even when we're telling ourselves that, even when we're sort of scrolling through the feed and telling ourselves this isn't real, this isn't a full representation of their lives, this is a tiny snapshot of a peak moment, I think we can still feel all of the fear of missing out feelings, the comparison feelings, and so on. So I think even with that knowledge, it can be hard to regulate the impact. And I wanted to get back to something you said earlier about kind of discrepancies. And so the happier countries have less wealth discrepancies, so they have much better social welfare systems, so they're taking care of their people. They have a little bit more even income distribution. And so countries like the US that have extreme wealth and extreme poverty generally have much lower rates of happiness, lower, health, just lower on a lot of measures. And so the suicide statistic is a little bit of kind of an outlier in the Scandinavian countries, but the speculation is just that it's if you're really unhappy, it's hard to be in a place where other people are happy.
Which I think anybody can relate with.
Yes. Yeah.
In wanting to understand what puts a person at particular risk for dying by suicide or even attempting suicide. For us, if I'm thinking back to like my master's program, for example, like I can in my mind create this list of, well, this person has access to means, check, and there are these questions that we're going to answer in order to assess somebody's risk. Can you speak about that kind of checkbox thinking about suicide risk versus like the actuality of like, here are the things we know really truly put people at risk? Because even I've thought the idea of like someone not having access to means, like, we always have access to means.
Yeah.
Like, unless you are in a locked room by yourself, even then you still would have access to some kind of means where you could end your own life if you wanted to.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that we do this checkbox thinking where it's like, okay, this person is insulated. And obviously, things like gun ownership change the numbers. But can you kind of address some of those check boxes versus the realities of what does suicide risk really look like?
Sure. So I do think, I do think suicide assessment is important, even though it can't be 100% accurate. So we have to, as clinicians, I think it's really difficult to kind of live with that level of risk of like, we don't know, we can't predict. A safety plan is not fail proof. Those things aren't fail proof. Some of the things that contribute to risk are family history of suicide, definitely previous suicide attempts. The means is interesting because, like you're saying, we can't prevent people from having access unless they're in a hospital, and even then, sometimes they get access. But there is really interesting research, though, saying that people tend to have a plan with a preferred means. And so if that means is restricted, then they're less likely to commit suicide. So, for example, if there was higher levels of gun control, our suicide rates would absolutely go down, even though people do have access to other means. The Golden Gate Bridge in the past was sort of a prime, it was a location that people chose to jump off of. So it was a suicide hotspot. And when they put the not gates, but like the fence up, that reduced suicides in San Francisco. And so there is actually evidence that reducing access to means can reduce suicides, even though people still have access. And there's kind of different levels of risk factor. Like some are sort of things that we don't have control over, and some are things that we do have control over. Like we don't have control over family history or things like, we don't have control over our age. People are at a higher risk once they hit 75, and we don't have control over that. But other things like connection are things that we do have control over. So things like connection, feeling a sense of meaning and purpose, I think can also really help give people a reason to live. Like if they feel like they are of value to other people or have a sense of belongingness, that can be another protective factor.
Your work is around upstream interventions, meaning trying to insulate somebody from the thought of, gosh, maybe I would be better off if XYZ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a major shift from the way that we do things in our general medical system. Like we tend to not be as hot at PEI, prevention and early intervention, as we are at reaction.
Yes, definitely.
Do you find that it's like, for lack of a better term, kind of a tough sell from a systems perspective? Before you and I were talking, before we were recording, we were talking about the phenomenon, and I've seen it as someone that's worked at universities, where it's that something happens, that there is a significant incident that becomes known to the student body, becomes known in the news, that suddenly it's this, oh, this is something we need to pay attention to. Is it hard to get traction for the idea of what if we did a better job up here instead of getting down to that point where it becomes a reaction to something that happened instead of trying to prevent it from happening to begin with?
Yes, I would say really, really tough sell. I'd say I've kind of been making this argument for, I don't know, 20 years, 25 years or something. And I know you had somebody on another episode who did a beautiful job of describing the difference between upstream and downstream prevention. But for people who aren't familiar with that, there's kind of like a story, to make it visual of like, imagine you are sitting by a stream, or, there's a group of clinicians sitting by a stream and enjoying the day, and somebody comes floating downstream and they're like waving their arms and like screaming for help. And so you run in the river and you pull them out because they're drowning. And then you feel great because you saved this person's life. So you saved this person from drowning. And then another person floats downstream and you rescue them. And then more and more people are floating downstream, and you're getting exhausted because you're pulling them out of the river. And that, I think, is where a lot of people in the medical and mental health field are, in terms of like just working, feeling exhausted, kind of intervening in the crisis moment. And then somebody's like, why don't we go upstream and see why people are getting in the river? Like what's making people fall in the river? Like maybe we could get to the direct cause and build a bridge or give them a life jacket or, take them somewhere else or, whatever it is. And so upstream prevention is really looking at addressing core causes and preventing that crisis point from ever happening. And our medical and our mental health fields, I think, are very much downstream, and they're sort of like wait until symptoms develop and then try to address or manage those symptoms or heal the problem, which is much harder and less effective than like how do we actually help people stay healthy. And so that is the work that I do. But I think sometimes that work is a lot less visible because it's a lot less visible if you work with somebody and they never even experience suicidal ideation, that's a lot less visible than if you hospitalize someone and prevent them from committing suicide. Um, so I think it's less visible. Um, it's sometimes like, I'm so kind of steeped in the prevention focus that I'm sort of like, I don't get it. Like, why aren't we focusing on this? Why is it so hard to get people to wrap their heads around this? And I'm not, I think the crisis intervention is always going to be important, but I think right now we probably give 90% of our resources to that and 10% to prevention. I'd like to see it be more like 80% to prevention and 20% to
Because you prevented the need for the downstream rescue.
yes. Like, imagine how much healthier we would all be, and even financially, it would save a ridiculous amount of money in the long term. But I think part of it is just short term thinking, because prevention isn't immediate. It takes longer to
Yeah, it takes
see.
time to make traction.
Yeah, yeah, and it's less concrete and visible. So
In thinking about how to even kind of formulate this next question I have, I've talked on the podcast before about how I'm a parent. And so I think for me, a lot of teaching for me comes down to a parent or a caregiver and what they're giving to the younger folk in their life. For you, as someone who understands these intricacies and the impact of social connection and relationship or loneliness on our risk of dying by suicide or attempting, if you had this little human ball of clay, like what would you do? What's your prescription, if you will, to try to prevent that suicide heart disease, if you will? Where it's like, well, here are the things, like we tell a kid, okay, like your plate should have lots of colors of food on it. That's how we keep our eyes healthy and our bones healthy and yada, yada, yada. But so looking at a young person, for example, where it's like, here's how we protect you and the people you care about in your community or your folks from attempting or dying by suicide. What does that look like?
yeah. So for me, I think about suicide prevention. I think you mentioned this in the introduction as building lives worth living, and I didn't come up with that line. That's actually a Marsha Linehan. That's kind of how she framed working with suicidal individuals, and I love that, so I use it. And to me, there's kind of four really important buckets of what it means to build a life worth living. And so those are kind of the things that I would want to focus on with a child. And the first one, number one, is connection. No surprise there. We've been talking a lot about that. So, even with young kids, like really encouraging them to socialize, and not to socialize necessarily in super structured ways, like to let kids just play with each other without necessarily being like you're doing the piano lesson or the sport or all of those things, which sports are awesome. Those things are great, but also allowing time for unstructured socialization where they're learning more how to navigate relationships and talk about, workout conflicts and all of that stuff to give them
So
practice.
more organic, kind of on the
Yeah.
fly social
Yeah.
interaction that
So
isn't necessarily like means to an end, like we're learning how to do a backflip the right way.
yes. So structured social activities are great. And also, I think recently there's a little bit more of a deficit of the unstructured, just playtime, which also allows for creativity, and imagination. The other thing, so one of the other buckets I would say is a sense of meaning and purpose, which I think even young children can do, like by helping out, both helping out at home, but also like, doing some volunteering with kids, doing things in the community, or even having conversations with them about what feels meaningful, what they like, how they feel when they do particular things. And also the emotional skills, the emotion regulation skills, which I think a lot of therapies focus on that. You know, CBT, DBT, ACT, all of the therapies. I would like, you know, if I were to create a therapy, it would be like connection, meaning, purpose, emotional skills, and health. Those are sort of the four buckets. But I think the emotional skills are important because we're all going to experience stresses, and some of us definitely have more of a buffer, you know, have more privileges that protect us from that, but nobody's protected completely. And so we're going to experience things and need to have some skills for just not being completely devastated by them, by like learning how to accept things being difficult and to get through that, and to kind of manage ourselves and take care of ourselves through that. And then the last bucket, health, I think, you know, things like sleep have a huge impact on mental health. And I don't really think we can separate mental and physical health. Like, I think we kind of talk about them as separate, but I think they both influence the other. And so taking care of our bodies is taking care of our mood as well. So those are the things that I would, you know, work on with a kid, or really work on with somebody of any age.
So again, for our listeners, those four buckets that Jessica just named were connection, meaning and purpose, emotional skills, and health. So as you're talking about that, I'm putting it kind of in therapist terms, and there's a part there for us in each one of those buckets, that even just the connection between client and therapist. If I have some place to be, I have someone who cares about me, I have someone who's asking me what happened with that job interview 2 days ago, you know, that I think many clinicians, myself included, I think struggle with the art of therapy. Like, it's a really interesting concept that we're talking about, of sitting with somebody else, of like, how do you quantify, how do you put a price on the care and concern and the conscientiousness, but that you're saying like this is a primary foundational part of what it means to have a life that's worth living. And I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that you're going to agree that even a paid person could contribute to somebody's sense of connection and contribute to a sense of a life worth living.
Absolutely. And even I think a lot of people don't have a lot of time to reflect in their lives. So even just asking questions around meaning and purpose, like what are some of the things that you do that you get a sense of meaning from, and asking people like how are your friendships, how are you feeling about the relationships in your life. So just kind of having these pulse points, or you know, check-ins, as well as giving people the opportunity to delve in and explore more. And one of the things I I think the emotion piece, the emotion regulation piece, of like the resiliency around going through difficulty, I think that's kind of a primary focus of therapy. What I like about adding in connection and meaning and purpose in particular are that they have a positive strength-based focus. And so I think sometimes when we're talking about what we're struggling with, we can kind of over-identify that with that. Like if we're talking about being depressed, we can, or a diagnosis, we can that can become a big piece of our identity. So like, I am depressed, as opposed to like, I am a person who's experiencing depression, you know? And so I think when you're talking about meaning and purpose, or you know, your relationships, positive aspects of your relationships, that helps people flesh out positive parts of their identity. And so that can really help create a more positive self-concept. And actually just doing some short things like values reflection has been shown to have a big impact on depression. So even just having short conversations with people about what they, what they care about in terms of values, in terms of contribution, impact, things like that can help them flesh out a more positive identity and can help with suicidality.
What you're saying is frankly so different than that checklist.
Yes. Yes.
And speaking as someone that has worked with all different levels of care, behavioral health facilities, talking about their initial assessment and things like that, we have a crisis note that's going to be auto-populated in the electronic health record. And part of it is almost always, still to this day, created a safety plan with the client, like created a list of 5 people that the person could call. And what I'm curious, and I know that this is opinion based. So listeners, this is me asking for Jessica's opinion. When we are already downstream and we have somebody who is just really fantasizing about things being a lot easier if they just weren't here anymore, like those problems would be solved. What do you grab out of these buckets? Because all of this research that's not like, let's create a safety plan. Like, well, do you? And what would that, like, what does your safety plan look like when you know all of these buckets and the research that's in these buckets?
Yeah. So I think if somebody is actively suicidal, you do have to like ask the questions to be like, is this something you're thinking about? Because there's as I said, for every completed suicide, there's 250 people seriously considering suicide. So there's obviously a really big leap between thinking about suicide and actually acting on that. So I think you have to kind of ask the questions to gauge the risk. And if the risk is not like, oh, this person needs to be hospitalized, I think a few things. One is to try to create some distance between the person and their thoughts, to kind of there's what is the line of like, just because you think it doesn't mean it's true. I think we sometimes are like, oh, I'm having these suicidal thoughts, therefore that means like I want to commit suicide. Not necessarily, but also, we're thinking stuff all the time. And so kind of trying to help people practice some disengagement from their thoughts and create some distance. I think mindfulness practices help do that, help people learn to observe their thoughts without feeling like they are their thoughts. There's some interesting research around talking to yourself in the third person, creating some distance. So instead of being like, I feel suicidal, being like, Jessica's feeling suicidal right now. And so that could sound really weird.
You just broke my brain a little bit. I've never heard that. That's very interesting.
Weird. So this is something that people with social anxiety has been shown to be really helpful with people with social anxiety as well. Instead of being like, oh my God, I'm so anxious, saying like, Jessica's so anxious, or even like, Jessica's got this, like encouraging yourself in the third person. So it just creates some emotional distance. And I know it sounds weird.
It's really interesting.
It could be like, don't necessarily talk out loud when you're talking to yourself in the third person, because people will think
that's a whole nother assessment that needs to happen.
A whole nother assessment. I was actually listening to a podcast who's the person said that this technique has really saved his relationship with his wife. When he's angry, when they're in a conflict, he says, the me is angry to himself, which is even weirder than saying your name. But he swears that it creates enough distance that he's then able to sort of back off of the anger and have a conversation. So that's one strategy, is sort of giving people some practices to disengage, so that even if they're having suicidal thoughts, that it's like, okay, they're happening and it's okay. Like, it doesn't mean I have to act on it. You were going to say something before I talk about
Just that your example there about how you would say it or how this other person was saying it to themselves, for me it rings a bell of act in I'm noticing that, I'm telling myself that, the same idea of distancing ourselves from that automatic thought where it's like, this is me, this is my reality, this is just what is, and creating just that slight level of space. But it's such an interesting intervention. But then going back to those buckets, that is about ultimately, I think, identifying meaning and purpose, as you were saying, kind of going back to our values and like how we're conceptualizing our lived experience.
Yeah. So like mindfulness is similar where you're observing your thoughts. So there's like one meditation of imagining your thoughts kind of like floating on a leaf on the stream or a cloud in the sky or things like that. So those are other ways to disengage with your thoughts. And I think helping people think about meaning and purpose, that can be hard if they feel like, oh, I don't have I don't have anything. But even people might not feel like they have meaning and purpose, but everybody has values. And so looking at values, like what's important to you, and there's lists of values that you can download from, you could just Google it online, and the motivational interviewing has lists of values and things to be used in motivational interviewing. So those are available, like looking through those, but like, asking people a question like, what has stopped you? Like, what has prevented you from acting on this? Are there things that you're currently living for? Is there anything that you're feeling hopeful about? Really trying to trying to leverage relationships. I think that can be hard when somebody is in deep depression because they can have really distorted thinking around their relationships, and it can feel very burdensome. But asking about the people who care about them. And also, like, I would say encouraging them to be helpful to somebody else because of that piece of burdensomeness of feeling like I'm such a drain, I'm such a drag to be around. Like, is there something that they can do, like, even if it's a small thing, like
Right,
five
like an
minutes a
offset.
week? Yeah, like where you're offering something to somebody, you're like reaching out and checking in with somebody else, or you're um whatever it is, helping somebody move, helping somebody you know with a meal, something that might feel really effortful to somebody who's depressed, but starting incrementally to really try to get them focused more on action and less on introspection, but also focused on things that are going to make them feel like a better person, if that makes sense. Like to to start to start feeling like they are valuable. There's James Clear. So completely out of the field of suicide prevention, but basically he's saying your every action you take is kind of a bid. It's kind of like we learn about ourselves through our actions. Like that's how we form our opinions of ourselves. And so I think we in therapy, and in lots of fields of life, we spend a lot of effort trying to change the way that we think. And sometimes it can be easier to change your action. So, like doing something small that then it's like, oh, like that's something a good person would do. That's something that somebody I respect would do. And then you start to have a higher opinion of yourself. And so, encouraging people and helping them really define what that is, like what that small action can be. Because again, when you're depressed, it's difficult to plan things. It's difficult to really even think clearly to sort of say like, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I'm going to, go grocery shopping for my neighbor who just had surgery. So whatever it is, but helping them sort of think through it. so that they feel like they're offering things of value. So some of the things that I would say. And going back to the checklist, because you were talking about the safety checklist, like the kind of checklist I would like to see. And I kind of got excited about this whole Surgeon General's report because I'm like, maybe doctors are now going to ask people about their relationships. Like, instead of just the checklist of do you smoke, like how much do you smoke, how much do you drink, how much are you exercising, which they do they ask that? I don't even know if they ask about exercise. Okay.
Many do now. They do.
Okay, so like also asking like, yeah, what, how satisfied are you with your relationships? Like putting that into the checklist. How, just like asking some questions about quality of life, how satisfied they are with their lives. Do they have anything that gives them a sense of meaning and purpose? So sort of having those things on the assessment as well as all of the usual stuff.
I think your concept of kind of borrowing the language from Marsha Linehan in the idea of creating a life worth living, if we're looking at those 4 buckets, I think it changes the perspective because it actually lends weight to the idea. And this is not to minimize anybody's lived experience or depression or their suicidal ideation or anything like that, but that all of these things matter to our sense of self and our way as we walk around the world. And that even the little things that could seem so insignificant can really make a difference. When's the last time you had a good night's sleep?
Yes.
When's the last time that you went on a walk with a friend or had a phone call? Like that I think sometimes we get, I know for myself, it's easy to get kind of in my head about like operationalizing, well, here are the things we have to do. But forgetting kind of that core of what it means to be human, and that there are small things we can do to nurture that, to just simply reconnect us with our own humanity that could ultimately be a step toward health and a step away from suicide risk.
Yes. And I think it also provides people with more options. So people who are, maybe going to therapy for depression and they're doing cognitive behavioral work and they're struggling with it. Like, then it's like, okay, and you can also try this. So not that you need to focus on all 4 things at once and be great at all of them, but they're different avenues, they're different ways in. Like, so if you're struggling with negative, critical, pessimistic thoughts, and you're trying to challenge them, or you're trying these other strategies that aren't helping you, then what about focusing on meaning and purpose? What about focusing on connection? What about exercising more? So I think it's just a little bit more of a holistic perspective. And there's things that some people are going to be more drawn to and that are going to work better for them. Like some people are, mindfulness is the thing that has changed their life.
The all end all. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm like, that's awesome. I fully believe in all of the research about mindfulness and all of its benefits. And I am not a meditator. Like, I just can't really do it. But I love journaling, and journaling, there's amazing research about the mental health benefits of journaling with some specific prompts. So that's another thing you could do with somebody who is suicidal, in that, kind of in that conversation, is, rather than kind of let's do the safety plan, like let's do a couple of journal prompts. Could be like thinking about what you're grateful for, or like finding something that went well this week, or did you make anybody smile this week, or just like little things you can provide different journal prompts for, to get people in the habit of writing, which kind of accesses a different part of your brain than verbal stuff, and can help people again, like to kind of reshape their identity. how they make sense of things.
I agree with you that I think this idea of viewing it from a more holistic lens is an important one. And I think it also can maybe redistribute some of the pressure that clinicians feel, where it's like, well, I did all the things. I did all of the things in that one book and that certification I have, and it didn't work. So, like, lost cause. Like, what do I do now? And it's like, no, there's actually a lot in that toolbox. We just need to remember it's a much more diverse toolbox than we're giving ourselves and humanity the credit for. And that's kind of like my takeaway from this conversation, is like to zoom out and look at all of these factors that are intersecting to create a life worth living. So how do we then try to influence that on our couches, with our clients, with ourselves, with our families, with our loved ones, to contribute to that? There's obviously so much more that can be said on this topic, Jessica. Thank you for kind of scratching the surface and introducing some of these ideas, because this is such a hard thing for anybody to talk about. And certainly for clinicians who've been touched by it in one way or another, it's hard for us to talk about suicide. It's very scary for anybody. And it's obviously a devastating phenomenon. For folks who want to learn more about you and about your work, what are the best ways to do that?
So the best way is my website, which is projectconnect-us.com. And that kind of shares a little bit about my work. I've sort of chosen to focus solely on the connection bucket, because I feel like it's really needed, and there's not a lot of other people doing that. And so for people who are interested, I've created a program called Project Connect, which is basically a small group 6-session program that helps facilitate relationship building and make it easier, and kind of take the pressure off of individuals to kind of figure out, like, how do I make friends? How do I build connection? So for people who are interested in becoming facilitators of that, they can check out the information on my site, or feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on there. And I'm also on LinkedIn. People can find me there too.
Awesome. Thank you again. It's through folks like you that have read a lot of the studies that help the other folks go, oh goodness, thank you for relaying that in like such a edible way so that I can use that information. So thank you for coming here and kind of cracking open the library in your brain so that we can learn from it. Because I think the ideas that you've introduced today are very important ones for us all to keep in mind, of what a life worth living looks like, what creating a worthwhile existence is all about. And I really appreciate the idea of getting out of the reaction-based mindset and getting into insulation for wholeness, for wellness.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of share these ideas with your audience, and to, as you said, to kind of like try to shift the balance between upstream and downstream. So thank you for having me.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive Continuing Ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need Continuing Ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our 1-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of Continuing Ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.